everybody, and welcome to my show, the Kale Zelden podcast. I am back here with Dr. Larry Chapp, who has recently concluded his four-part series called The Numbing Down of the Church. Since we last saw you, Larry, you've been quite prolific. You've come out with part two, which was called The Pod People Catholicism of the Left. Part three was the Tridentine traditionalists and their vendetta against Vatican II. And finally, part four, which is the universal cult to holiness and the semi-donatist option, sort of. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I love that. That's going to be some fun when we get to that. But I guess for today, I want to hold off on really getting into to the guts of number four, because I think that's what you've been writing one, two, and three in order to get to.
Right, exactly. That's the
So
point.
yeah, so in really sort of what kind of sits the kind of the behemoth that sits in the midst of your piece is really, as it always seems to be for all of us here in 2021 Catholicism, the council, right? The
Oh, yeah.
council, the reasons for it, the dark reasons of how it came to be, perhaps, or the bright reasons for how it came to be, what was done at the council, and I think more than anything, the immediate aftermath. So in part two, you focus on parts two and three, I should say. You focus on the responses. So why don't you, if you could just do a quick layout of the various camps or responses to the council, and then we can dive into sort of this double naivete question you talk about.
Okay, sure. Uh, Obviously, anybody who lived through the immediate aftermath of the council, one of the very first groups you're going to notice would be whatever you want to call it. I call them the liberals. You could call them the progressives, whatever. But they were characterized by a deep desire to emphasize a more horizontal approach to the faith rather than the vertical and supernatural elements. So you saw that in church architecture with churches in the round and the liturgy. And then you also saw it with this tremendous emphasis on social justice.
Sure.
In other words, reaching out to our brothers and sisters, which obviously in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But the faith was almost reduced to that.
So you call it a
Truly.
kind of horizontalism. Can you sort of what do you mean by that? And obviously you're setting this up as sort of over and against a kind of verticalism, or
Yeah, the idea sort of when I say horizontalism is an exaggerated sense in which the grace of God is and God's salvation is already present everywhere in the world. It's kind of Runarianism on steroids. Yeah, yeah, this notion that when you bring the gospel to other people, you're actually simply announcing to them something they already have, they just don't know it. And so a great de-emphasis on the actual particulars of the faith as attaching us to something supernatural that we need through the sacraments, through the doctrines, through the lived life of a specific Christological holiness. All of that sort of, they pay lip service to it, but then it just sort of gets shoved aside in favor of this idea now that what we need to be doing is simply loving our neighbor. They sort of forget that love of God demanded worship and things like that. It's just love of neighbor, love of neighbor, love of neighbor. And that then attached itself to all kinds of trendy, lefty political causes, some of which were good, like the fight against racism
of course.
in the 1960s, the anti-war movement, and so on. And so it kind of attached itself to some rather legitimate things, but lacking the internal Christian principle, it easily allowed itself then to morph over time into what we see today, sort of woke cancel culture.
Sure.
Uh, and the whole emphasis on LGBTQ and all of that sort of thing. I tell people all the time, it used to be that liberals were about big causes like fighting world hunger, anti-war, economic justice, racism. And now it's almost like, well, all we care about, is sexuality.
Yeah, and it's funny. My sense it jives with that, and that it used to be when I was, sort of growing up in the, I mean, growing up sort of intellectually
Yeah.
in the '90s, that the liberals would accuse conservatives of a kind of fixation with genital questions, right? The below the belt questions. And
Yeah.
it's funny, now there seems to have been some sort of flip or reverse there.
Yeah, you hear all the time from liberals, the church is obsessed with sex.
Yeah,
No,
yeah, yeah,
they are.
yeah.
The church talks about all kinds of things, but the only thing, that they pick up on and run with is when the church does speak on sex.
Yeah.
All right, so the Vatican has put out lots of documents, but what gets paid attention to? The latest CDF document on not blessing same-sex unions. All the other stuff gets ignored. But to go back to the what I mean by liberal and the horizontal, I'll just give you a concrete example from my own life. I lived this.
Yeah.
I didn't go to Catholic school, so I was in catechism. And I remember distinctly my first communion class and then later my confirmation classes. We didn't really learn about the Eucharist or communion. We made little collages of poor kids in the ghetto and cut out little things from articles from the newspaper on hunger and justice and stuff, which is fine, but we never learned about the Eucharist. And that to me is sort of an example that serves as a microcosm for anybody who didn't live through it and is not old enough to remember it, simply doesn't know the extent to which the faith had gotten watered down by these people into a kind of generalized humanitarianism.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And, and I also received no sustained catechism. I had a teacher here or there who had been sort of steeped in the old way, quote unquote. And so I got a little bit of that, but I never, in fact, I remember the only reason why I had a sense, for instance, of the real presence was, I remember I was 11 years old. I was in the fifth grade, and I was an altar server. And at the end of Mass, Father Vogler, I think it was, yeah, Father Vogler, he asked me to take the vessels from the little side altar, the side
Yeah,
table, right, and bring them into the sacristy. And he said, Kale, make sure that you wash out you put the chalice in this sink and the other things can go in the other sink. And I remember, well, why? And he sort of told me, well, and like it was fascinating to me as a fifth grader that
yeah,
the church was so serious about this, at least in theory,
yeah.
that they had two different sinks in the sacristy and were doing. I'm like, oh, and that sort of, so then later on, when I was reading my way back into the church as a young adult, when I was really encountering the sort of the theology of transubstantiation, I was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I get this, but it wasn't automatic.
Yeah.
That's for
And
sure.
it's not necessarily, in some cases it was, but usually it wasn't deliberate. Oh,
Yeah,
we're going to not talk about real presence and stuff. There was just this presumption, oh, they already know that, so we're going to move on to this other stuff. But there's two other
yeah,
aspects that pertain directly to the theme of the numbing down of the church and
yep,
about our numbing down to sin. That is also characteristic of what I call the liberals. First, Vatican II said that we need to read the signs of the times, right? Famously, we need to read the signs of the
yep,
times. Now, the reason why the council said that is so that we can understand what the problems of the modern world are, so we can evangelize more effectively. But liberals read the signs of the times in order for us to transform ourselves into those signs of the times. That's what I mean by they were cultural appeasers. So if
yeah,
the modern world is okay, say couples cohabitating before marriage, well, the church needs to acknowledge that. That's where people are. And so we can't be judgmental. And so we need to move in that direction. But that's not what the council meant by reading the signs of the times, transforming. So that then led to something else. And this is very important. Liberals, after the council, tended to believe that the preconciliar church emphasized sin too much, sin and repentance and conversion. And so there was this big downplaying of this notion that we're sinners and we need to go to confession and we need to. They saw all that as a kind of scrupulosity. So there was this whole, in the 60s and 70s, this whole, I don't know if your viewers will get this reference, the whole I'm okay, you're okay sort of approach to the pastoral life. Very 70s. By the way, the guy who wrote that book committed suicide. I'm okay, you're okay. And I once saw a great play at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis called I'm Okay, You're a Jerk. And, and I thought that was That was a great riff on the whole thing. But anyway, the idea was that they emphasize God loves you just as you are, and you still hear this among liberals, especially with regard to oh yeah, it's God loves you just as you are, which means he's not calling you to conversion. He's not God made you this way. All of these so-called sins that you have are simply part of the warp and woof of who you are and your identity. And so you need to celebrate who you are instead of being down on yourself and all this kind of stuff. So liberals want to leave people where they are. They don't want to call them up to a higher level of holiness or conversion, in repentance in a sort of old-fashioned meaning of those words. And to me, that's the most deleterious effect of liberal Catholicism is this so-called celebration of your identity just as you are.
As they say.
Yeah. All right, and one last thing with regard to liberals and sort of leaving us where they are. One of the standard arguments, and I'm not just talking about the issue of homosexuality.
Sure.
One of the standard arguments is, well, I've got all these sort of deep-seated tendencies that are part of my identity, and I was either born with them or they were deeply ingrained to me at a very early age, that I didn't choose them, and so on. And therefore, they're from God. God made me this way. You hear
That's
this all
it.
the time. Like, I have a deep-seated tendency, must have got it from my youth, towards impatience and aggravation with other people. It's something I've struggled with my entire life. I mean, it's truly awful how impatient and aggravated I get with other people. And it's something deeply ingrained, but I certainly don't think God made me that way. I had a sister that was born with a heart defect. She lived for 5 short years, suffered greatly, and then died post-surgery 3 days later. I don't believe that God gave her that birth defect.
Right.
I don't believe it was God's direct will that she be born. In other words, it wasn't a good thing.
Right.
So we need to dispense entirely and retire it once and for all this argument that just because something seems deeply ingrained in my identity, that it therefore comes from God. It may not come from God. And, that's why we have the church and the virtues and all those sorts of things to guide us.
Right. That something is bent and broken that needs reparation. Right.
Yeah.
Is this I hesitate to go here because of you quip about Hegel in part 3,
Yeah.
but is this a sort of a strange version of Hegel's philosophy of right? That's just, if it is, it must just, it was supposed to be. I don't know. I'm sort of
Yeah, I
throwing that
mean,
out
I
there.
don't know if they think that deeply or we're thinking that deeply.
Yeah, I'm giving perhaps too much credit.
As I said in the post, I think some of it has to do with the kind of infectious naturalism of our time. And I accept evolutionary theory.
Me too.
And I accept that many of these things within us come from our evolutionary past,
Yep.
our animal past. But they then, this is why sin gets transformed into sort of, well, we have certain flaws within us that require therapy and scientific remediation from the social sciences, because these are just things that came to us from evolution. They're not sins. They're just part of my biology or my psychology, and science can fix that. We don't need
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, and it's a way, I think, of avoiding the necessary and difficult work of holiness, that I know we'll get into later, but you can call it, self-improvement or owning yourself or taking personal responsibility for yourself and your being and for those around you. I mean, I think it's just a version of giving up on responsibility.
One last
personal
thing to it. I agree completely with that. And I don't want to be too hard on liberals here in one sense, because they actually do believe in conversion and change in a certain respect. In other words, they do hold strongly that we should all convert away from being racists, or
Sure. Yeah.
we should all convert away from toxic masculinity, and
Right.
and that's all true. And so they do have a certain standard. So in some ways, I think they're moving away from holiness and sin is because they view those things as code word for sexual morality.
Interesting.
And what they really are in terms of a lot of their arguments, they're conclusions in search of an argument. In other words, they have their conclusion in place, which is we need to adopt modern sexual mores. And then they reverse engineer the church's teaching to make it seem like, yeah, we can bless those modern sexual mores. In other words, I'm not certain they really believe all their own arguments.
Well, that's worth delving into, and maybe we'll do it elsewhere. But I think we should probably press on to
Yeah.
parts 2 and 3 of the taxonomy. So do you
Yeah.
want to start with
Oh,
the
yeah. So part
do you-
two of the
yeah,
taxonomy, that's what I call it, and now you're
yeah.
calling it that,
I like it. I like it.
which is good. The classification is my criticism of the what we now call the neoconservatives or the neocons. And what that would be in the post-conciliar church, a group of people who were not liberals, who accepted all of the church's doctrines on sexuality and Christology and ecclesiology. So they were orthodox. But they were also devotees of modern political liberalism, modern political democracy and its concepts of civil rights and human rights, separation of church and state. In other words, the American project. And so when I
Yeah.
talk about neocons, I don't know to what extent this was prevalent in Europe or other places in the world. I do know the American iteration of this in folks, like George Weigel and Michael Novak and people like that. And my
Newhouse, of course.
Newhouse, and one of my great intellectual heroes, David L. Schindler, who runs Communio down in
Oh yeah,
Washington,
yeah,
D.C.,
yeah.
is a big critic of that whole
Right.
sort of John Courtney Murray.
I was going to bring up Murray, so I'm
Weigel
glad you
story.
did. Yeah.
Murray is the kind of Grundschrift. He's the
Yeah.
urfather of all of this sort of stuff. In his book, We Hold These Truths, where he says, look, America is actually a crypto-Catholic country because if you look at our constitutional order, it's rooted in English common law, which was rooted in Thomistic principles. Therefore, not only are Catholics not foreigners to the American project, we are actually the best interpreters of the American project. Now, remember, he wrote that in 1960. The Kennedy,
I thought it was late 50s. I didn't know if it was just before
that's when
Kennedy.
we're trying to get Kennedy elected and so on. And then the council hits, and you have the Murrayites and the Americans trying to convince the council fathers to adopt a notion of religious freedom rooted in the American constitutional order. They did not win. A lot of people think they did, but they didn't. The council, in talking about religious freedom, actually adopted the French model, which Wojtyła supported. That truth is the most important thing here. Truth trumps freedom in a sense.
So can I ask you then, Larry? Because it's funny, you say that I was going to say, ignorantly perhaps, that it seems like the Murrayites won, but you're going to make an argument that's sort of a Murrayite, kind of Americanist Jesuit version of liberal accommodation, I guess. Versus a sort of a French model of acceptance of the sort of the tenets of liberalism. Would you mind just giving a quick relief between the two of those? Because I'm not aware of the French one as much as you are.
The traditional teaching of the church, of course, is that all human beings have an obligation to seek the truth about God, right. A moral obligation to do so. And that also goes for government. Therefore, once government recognizes the truth of Catholicism, it has the obligation to, in a sense, make Catholicism the state religion. That was sort of standard. And the Vatican II comes along, and if you read Nostra Aetate, Dignitatis Humanae, where they lay out the right to religious freedom, they make it very clear. They're not saying anything at all about confessional states, about whether or not Catholicism should be an official. It just sort of leaves that question hanging and says, we're not going to deal with that, essentially. What we're going to deal, and they reaffirm, the French reaffirm, we do have this moral obligation to seek the truth about God. That comes first. However, truth is constitutively oriented towards freedom. This is the new insight. This is where it is still actually traditional, because what the council has done is to broaden its view of the tradition and go back and retrieve this notion from the earliest centuries of the church that the faith cannot be coerced. I mean, the church has always held that forced conversions are bad, but even short of forced conversions, the ancient church held that we should not even coerce faith out of people. And state-sponsored religion is a subtle form of coercion. Now, the council doesn't say that therefore all instances of confessional states are bad, but they want to emphasize that faith, the truth of faith, is deeply constitutively oriented towards its free acceptance. And
So
this is true of all human beings, and therefore the right to religious freedom is rooted in the fundamental dignity of every single human being to seek the truth in freedom.
Right. I think that's such an important thing, because you see this in sort of trad com boxes, sort of
Right.
the flexing of of rigorism, I guess they would say. It's a kind of maybe a integralism.
Yeah.
That and I know this is a real hang up. Some people seem to enjoy the idea of a state enforcing Catholic confessional morality, etc. But they also seem to enjoy the idea that it seems to be a power love more than anything. And so you'll hear, whether they'll say it or not, the subtweet of all of the comments is error has no rights.
Error has no rights. It's true. Neither does truth. Those are abstractions.
Yeah.
Persons have rights, including
Yeah.
persons who are in error,
Yeah.
which includes all of us at some point in our lives.
Yeah.
But the thing is,
But
the
I
more
want you to
I-
lay out more about the neocons, because I know we're using that phrase neocon,
Yeah,
and
so
it's
the
kind of an
point-
imperfect
the point
thing. But
then is that in the United States, after the council, the perception arose, and I think this is where the rad trads take this, and they're not entirely wrong. The rad trad insight here, that a kind of religious indifferentism
yes,
and
thank you.
relativism set in after the council. They're wrong to think that the council was the cause of it, but they're right to see, at least in the United States, the Murrayite vision won. And so the neocons come along. Of course, the liberals are all indifferentists and relativists and all that. But the neocons come along with a subtle version of this that says the American model of the separation of church and state is the way to go. And therefore, we need to, in dealing with the political landscape, we need to develop a language of moral discourse that brackets the specific categories of the faith, brackets the creed, brackets the hard edge of the gospel, and translates it all into a kind of neutral natural law language, so we can discuss moral issues of war and peace or abortion or marriage and these sorts of things. And so the project was, we're going to live within the parameters of this constitutional arrangement, and we're going to bless it and baptize it, all the while, in a sense, playing in their sandbox, because by developing a neutralist form of moral discourse that brackets the faith, you're actually engaging in a form of secular discourse, whether you realize it or not.
Okay, so good. So what, if we do our best to sort of steel man the argument, really kind of give it its due, what do you think it accomplished, and what do you think it missed? What was the blind spot? Because I can see a certain attractiveness to that project.
Well, I was a neocon.
Okay, well, why was it attractive to you?
It was attractive to me because I was not yet fully conversant as a younger guy with sort of what was wrong with political liberalism, what was wrong with the American experiment in our constitutional order. That there are blessings to it, but there are also deep metaphysical problems with it. I wasn't completely aware of that, so I was perfectly comfortable with being an American and a Catholic and living within this arrangement. And so I really did think that, okay, as long as the government leaves us alone to pursue our faith, when we deal with political matters, it is important that we not get all Jesus preachy with them. It's
a kind of sophistication, right?
In other words, it was a reaction in me against the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and the evangelicals out there saying the Lord Jesus condemns homosexuality, blah blah blah. It's like, oh, please shut up. You're
making us look like fools, people.
Yeah. You're going to make us all look like complete idiots. But then again, as I thought of, so I bought into Novak and Weigel and all these guys, and I read John Courtney Murray, and I said, yeah, this sort of neutralist language is the way to go. But over time, I began to realize, you know what, it didn't work.
Okay, good. So I just to jump in real quick, I agree. For me, it was a wonderful thing to be able to be as sort of giddy and enthusiastic about Christmas as I could be about July 4th, right? To sort of use those sort of two basic models. And I saw there was no conflict and everything was hunky dory, everything was peachy, and to a point, I get that. But what are the blind spots there, and what was the fruit of that project, do you think?
The blind spot was in thinking that our largely secular, liberal, technocratic culture gave a darn about any of it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, as I say in the last one here, I mean, one of the naivetes, we'll get to it later, but one of the naivetes of the council and of the neocon movement in general was this sort of presumption that, and this was Newhousian, that
Yeah.
American culture, because it's crypto-Catholic, is just sort of waiting with bated breath for the Catholic Church to say something here.
The Catholic moment, right? Isn't
Yeah,
that the
the
name?
Catholic moment. This is
Yeah.
our moment because it's ripe. These people are ripe for this message, and they weren't. They weren't ripe.
Not at all.
Not
Right.
at
Not
all.
at
In
all.
fact, our elites completely loathed uh, Catholic neocons, saw them as silly. And the other thing about natural law theory, and I support natural law theory, but I don't support the neocon attempt to turn it into a form of secular political discourse in the United States. Because here's the deal. If you read Aquinas, what is natural law? Natural law is simply our reason recognizing and therefore participating in the divine reason, in the divine forms that we see in the natural world. We can discern, say, the teleology of our nature, the ends of our nature, and the plan that God had for our nature, and therefore our entire natural law morality is based on the idea that we need to respect those God-given teleologies. That's why I can't, I can put on mascara, it doesn't make me a woman. Uh, right?
Canceled. Canceled. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that we have to respect those sorts of things. But notice something. Therefore, natural law theory depends entirely on the acceptance of a single proposition. God exists and he is the creator. Now, if you don't accept that proposition, then natural law theory makes no sense to you.
Meaningless. It's meaningless. Yeah.
I mean, all secularists are some version of a utilitarian and a pragmatist. They have to be.
Why? Because they ignore first causes.
Well, yeah, because they don't understand why the teleology of anything should be normative. Why should our certain aspects of our nature be normative? Why
Well,
can't,
give me an example. Give me an example of that, Larry.
well, for example, if I have a even though I'm a man, if I have a deep-seated feeling that I'm actually, I'm Tanya inside, then I can go and surgically have my genitals removed and replaced with female assembling parts or whatever. I can have breast implants and hormones pumped into me because the teleology of my nature born as a man is not normative. It's plastic.
It's right. I would
And
say
this
it's
is a
plastic,
result,
not binding. Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
it's fungible, which is a result of the technocratic mentality of our society that we and the sort of naturalism I was referring to before. We're simply in this view, we are nothing more than trousered apes. We're bipedal ambulatory chemistry sets. That's
Right.
what we are. Okay?
It's a great line.
And that's all we are. And therefore, if we can manipulate that on the genetic level or whatever, if we can cybernetically plant computer chips in my brain or genetically enhance the size of my brain, and so all of that is allowable to us because teleologies are not normative.
And I don't know why that's not more terrifying to people. I
Yeah, I
mean
don't.
that. I don't know. I mean, because for me, that terrifies me. I mean, anybody who's looked at their own children, deeply in the face and beheld them, whether as infants or toddlers or teenagers, you know, when you gaze into their eyes, their being, that they there is a natural teleos there, like telos there, and to pretend that they're just a sort of an elaborate flesh Lego set is
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
is disgusting. I mean it. I
Yeah.
want to be measured here in my speaking, but it's shocking to me that we are that open to the sort of that you call it sort of techno utopianism.
Yeah, and see, this is the blind spot, I think, then, to go back to
Okay,
what
good. Yeah, good. Thank you.
this is the blind spot of the neocons to not recognize this. And part of it is because there was an agenda. That's why also it's part of the numbing down of the church. There was an agenda with Richard Newhouse, who I admired, and the other neocons, and that was economic. And
Okay.
it wasn't just a blessing of the American constitutional order, it was a blessing of capitalism.
And why? In its best, in its best, let's steel man it first before we render a
Well,
critique.
the steel man, you would go to Michael Novak because he
Okay.
was the one who wrote the most about how corporate America, capitalist America, is just this profound manifestation of gospel values of communitarianism. You can't
Okay.
have a corporation that isn't corporate, and so on. And so it's not just that capitalism was this great engine for driving wealth and so on. The sort of philosophy behind it was that it creates these vast zones of economic freedom in which human beings can form their own sort of localist economic alliances and create economic communities that are very, very gospel based. If you wanted, in Michael Novak. Now, there's a certain amount of truth. I'm not a socialist,
Right.
right, or any of, but I think that they're part of their pushing of this capitalism was very abstract and philosophical and ideological, and did not pay enough attention to the concrete manner in which American-style capitalism had serious problems with it.
Right. So what was the apocalypse for this? In other words, what was the moment of revelation in which this naivete that we're calling it was rendered exposed, in your estimation?
Well, I think it was a sort of rolling and gradual awareness. You know, as the Reagan Revolution sort of died out and John Paul's papacy was sort of coming to an end, and you saw the election of Bill Clinton, and then
NAFTA, like NAFTA, is that?
yeah, in NAFTA and stuff. But then you get milquetoast George Bush, and then Obama gets. But I really think if you want to point to one thing,
Yeah.
it's the Obergefell decision.
Okay, good.
Of the Supreme Court.
I thought that might be where you were going. I didn't want
Yeah.
to put words in your mouth.
The
Why do you think that was the great exposing of the inadequacies of this sort of natural law disposition, this sort of standpoint of neocon sensibilities?
I think because it showed that on an issue of sort of fundamental importance, the neocon arguments failed to persuade
Like at all?
at all. And well, of course, in other words, to steel man this, let's be fair.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
When gay marriage was put up for a referendum to the people, even in states like California, it was voted down.
Right.
So we got gay marriage.
Was that Prop 8? Is that Prop 8, I
Proposition
believe?
8, and so on. So, but I'm not certain that opposition to gay marriage on a popular level, at least initially, was a result of neocon arguments. I think it was just a lot of people with a sort of yuck factor.
Yeah,
saying,
the residue of the yuck
the residue
factor.
of yuck factor, like, well, two men kissing in public, that's not we're not going to, no. But see, the yuck factor is not a good argument because
No, of course not.
it wears off after a while, right? Especially then you get Obergefell, and now 80% of Americans say, yeah, gay marriage is great, love is love, and all that sort of stuff. But so the neocon project failed to persuade, and this is very, very important. It failed to persuade even Catholics,
Right.
and that's very telling.
Right.
That it failed to persuade even Catholics. Part of the reason why it failed to persuade was that it was overly academic, for starters, and not evangelical enough, which is one of my points. That the church, instead of latching onto these neocon arguments, should have been pushing a more rigorous, gospel-based, evangelical-based notion of why these things are wrong. Because, you hear people in the gay rights movement, for example, say all the time, I know Jesus loves me. It's not as if they're making completely and totally secular argument. They often make, and Catholic liberals do, religious arguments.
Yeah.
Jesus was about the marginalized. Gays are marginalized. Therefore, Jesus loves gays. And he does love gays.
Of course. Yeah.
All right? He does. But not necessarily the sin, the act, and so on. And that's the distinction. Jesus dined with prostitutes, but he didn't sleep with prostitutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and therein lies the difference. But I think I made fun of evangelicals before, but if you look at how evangelicals approached the issue, they approached it in a Jesus-based model, a certain lacking in philosophical and theological subtlety. But I wish the church had done a little more of that in order to counteract this bromide that's out there that, well, Jesus loved everybody, and so love is love and all that.
Right.
And the
Well, I mean,
neocons
that's that sort of easy anodyne moralistic therapeutic deism, right?
Yeah, and the neocons were just in their little ivory towers there, spinning their academic yarns, concocting these natural law arguments that absolutely convinced nobody on these, and some of their arguments are great, but
Yeah, they're elegant. They're lovely.
elegant. Read Robert George on
Right.
marriage and stuff.
Yeah,
Robert George is
right.
great. Okay, but that's because I already believe in God and the Catholic Church, and so it's a kind of preaching to the choir. A lot of these natural law arguments, and that's the problem with them. They're convincing to the choir, but nobody else
Good.
who doesn't accept some of their premises. Now, I want to make it clear, though, in terms of numbing down the church, the neocon response is not as horrible as the liberal response. The two responses are not symmetrically bad. There's an asymmetry there. If somebody put a gun to my head and said neocon or liberal, well, I'd choose the neocon.
Yeah.
But I think there were some serious deficits and deficiencies in their approach.
All right, great. All right, well then, so I think this is helpful actually, Larry, because I think I've been struggling as of late to understand this simple point, which is that the church happens in history, and as a kind of wide-eyed, glowy, pious son of the church, I tended to think of the church as sort of existing above and outside of time and historical contingencies. And so I think it's a very helpful reminder for us to remember that actually that's not true, right? That the church happens in history. It drives history oftentimes. It sets tones, it sets courses, but it happens in history. And I think this is actually will come up later on when we do the last piece together on what do we do now. But it's a long preamble to get to this question. So 2015 is Obergefell. And this is coinciding with, I would say, almost the... I have to go back and look at all the historical little details of 2015, but I believe Pope Francis makes a trip to North America in 2015. And if you recall, there was a civil servant in Kentucky, I don't remember her name right now, who refused to sign the marriage certificates for gay marriage. And Pope Francis
met with her,
and it's a very interesting question as to, well, how did that happen and who made that happen, et cetera. And there was all kinds of court drama, as there always is with especially this pontificate. But it was right around this time that Francis is losing his, I would say, grace period amongst conservative-minded, orthodox-minded Catholics.
Right.
And so this might be a way for us to tack now to our third portion of the taxonomy, which is the sort of, the traditionalists or the neotrads or the radtrads or what you call in the piece, the sort of the Tridentine Catholicism movement, which, I have to say until 2015 was pretty fringe. I'm a very online Catholic. I'm a very serious Catholic, and I'm a conservative Catholic, and I always, knew about it, but it was still pretty marginal. But I think we can safely say since 2015, at least, that there has been an explosion of this popularity of this third response. So let's get into the third response.
Okay. Hey, before we do that, if you might indulge me, something just popped into my head that I wanted to say with regard to the neocons, and I think it's very, very important. So I want to finish this up. I started to say when I was saying about capitalism, and of course there's the economic side of it. But one of the things and this is what undercuts their natural law arguments, in endorsing the American capitalist project, they're also endorsing technocracy and consumerism, which created the very ideology of choice in the first place that then led to gay marriage and Roe v. Wade and all these sorts of things, because American capitalism and American society in general emphasizes the atomized, autonomous, choosing individual. That is the model. Homo consumerus. That's right. Is what we are. And the neocons did not challenge that.
Right.
And that undercut their entire natural law project.
Yeah, and I think this is why somebody like Rod Dreher was correct in focusing on that. Is it the Casey decision in which Justice Kennedy,
We're
I
free to
really,
make up our own meaning in life.
yeah, the mystery of life, and we can
Yeah.
all make it up as we go. I really should just have that quotation and sort of put a little post-it note on the
And
top
the
of my
neocons
computer
were upset
screen.
with that too, but they didn't
But
seem
they didn't have a response to it, did they?
no, because it would have undercut the entire American concept of
Good.
freedom and liberty. And
That's good.
anyway,
Good.
but anyway, to the rad trads, or I call them Tridentine traditionalists now for two reasons. Number one, I think it's actually a more accurate description. Rad trad is a bit of a pejorative,
Yeah, agreed.
and so I want to be respectful to what it is that they really are, and what it is. It seems to me. And you have to be careful. There's all kinds of different traditionalists.
Of course, yeah. Of course.
The Tridentine traditionalists are the ones who want to emphasize that the form and structure and liturgy of post-Trent Catholicism that lasted, from the 16th to the middle part, of the 20th century, had a lot going for it. I don't want to put words in their mouth and say it's the only form of the church that's allowed. No, they just thought that it was very strong, had a lot going for it, and is a model that should not have been abandoned so quickly.
Right.
And
so it's always 1570.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, and I mean that as someone who has a deep esteem and appreciation for church history. But remember, Trent happens later than it should have, perhaps, but it happens in 1570, which is, of course, again, for those of people in the audience, let's do a quick reset here, Larry. What is Trent, and what is it a response to? Trent is Tridentine, by the way. So
That's what it meant by Tridentine. Post-Trent is that it was the ecumenical council called by the church in response to the Protestant revolt, the Protestant heresy that was sweeping over Europe. I think one of the reasons why it was called so long after the Reformation, a couple things, they needed time to muster the resources, theological and otherwise, but also because I think we tend to be anachronistic in our reading of history. I think that during those immediate decades after the Reformation, I think that many in the church still held out hope that this was going to just blow over.
Correct.
That it was a temporary thing, that these people would come back to Catholicism. And it wasn't until it became very clear, especially after Henry VIII, that this is not going away, that the church felt like they had to deal with it. So in Trent issues a lot of anathemas, a lot of condemnations of various heresies, but more importantly, Trent also it recognized that the Protestant revolt happened because of stupidity and immorality in the clergy, corruptions in the church. So it set up a series of institutional reforms that were quite good in actually creating the modern seminary system and so on.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you could flesh that out. Seminaries, liturgies,
It standardized the liturgy. It created the seminaries. It reformed the clerical life, set up all kinds of new canons for dealing with clerical life and so on. So a lot of positives came out of that council. It really did sort of shore up the foundation. The problem is that for several centuries after that, really until Vatican II, right, that model didn't change much. In other words, Trent was essentially a defensive and reactionary council.
Right.
And so you get
not for, see, and I think what people, even the sort of the very pro-Trent folks, don't seem to give voice to is that Trent is already reactionary. Yes. Right. Trent does not, when you're someone who's sort of browsing the internet in 2021 and you look at the sort of the robust quality of Trent and they're not afraid to sort of tell it like it is Trent, what we fail to recognize, at least in my appreciation, we failed to recognize that it was a defensive posture, did not come out of a place of strength. It actually came out of a place of weakness, and defeat. And I think we forget that at our peril.
Oh, we do. Because there's then a double whammy with regard to this defensiveness you're talking about. Not just the Reformation, but then the full effects of the Enlightenment kick in.
Yeah, right.
And so by the 19th century, you're getting Darwinism and rationalism and secularism, and a lot of countries in Europe that were traditionally Catholic with confessional states are reacting anti-clerically against the church. That simply causes more retrenchment, more defensiveness. And so
retrenchment, maybe we might call that.
I said in an email to you, what happens is is that the tradition gets shrunk down. Okay, if you think of the tradition as a river system with all these tributaries flowing into a main channel, which is what it is, what Trent did, and for 400 years, the church, in a sense, dammed up the tributaries for flood control, and then dredged up the main channel, made it deeper and easier for navigation, and easier to straightened it and deepened it and all those sorts of things. And so what you get is this highly standardized scholastic theology and this highly standardized clerical discipline and so forth, where the church fathers, who cares about them? Aquinas is the only dude that matters.
Even the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament is like,
Augustine is suspect. The scriptures are just used as proof texting. Modern biblical scholarship is, which obviously has huge problems, but it also has great insights. And that's just summarily rejected the scriptures. So in other words, the emphasis became theology as a form of apologetics. Theology as a form of argument in order to defend the church. And it created this extremely suffocating theological environment. And I'm not just talking here about the forbidden index of books and things like that. It's
I am, Larry. But anyway, go ahead. You're right. What did it stifle beyond the list of books you can't read?
Creativity and tapping into all those dammed up tributaries. I mean, like I said, even Augustine became a suspect, and so by the time you get to the 20th century in Ressourcement Théologie, which was disparagingly called the New Theology, the Nouvelle Théologie, because they dared go beyond the narrow confines of this arid Neoscholasticism.
Okay.
We need to look at the fathers.
Right.
We need to look more deeply at Scripture. And we need to for example, you find a Thomist who's not even a Thomist. Actually, I'll explain this. Joseph Pieper was a German philosopher.
One of my faves.
Mid part of the 20th century. And he knew Plato and Aristotle and Thomas, all of them. And one of his main points is, and it's going against this channelization I'm talking about, Pieper says there should be no such thing as Thomism, because Thomas would be appalled at that.
Yeah.
Thomas was simply writing. He was simply doing philosophy and doing theology and pulling together bits and pieces of every. You read Thomas, I mean, he's quoting the fathers. He's quoting Augustine. He's quoting Plato. He's quoting Aristotle. He's quoting the Muslims and the Jews, all right, and bringing it all into this Summa and things. But it wasn't yet Thomism.
He's the ultimate model, and I made this point in a piece that I published on 1 Peter 5 about a year ago, that he isn't scripture, but he's a damn good model for how we are to proceed. Read widely, generously, pretend that somebody you're talking to might have something that you can learn from, instead of this sort of prissy sort of literal scriptural. It really is kind of a form of modernism, isn't it? Thomism.
Well, I think it is, because it's a form of rationalism.
Yeah,
like I said, it's an attempt at doing theology for the express purpose of a kind of defensive argumentation, proof texting, to prove the truth. I mean, if you go back to the old Neoscholastic manuals from the middle part of the 20th century, and read, and this is what guys were being taught in the seminary, it's so deductive. It's like, here's a truth of revelation. Here's a couple of arguments. Ergo, this is why the Catholic Church is the true Church of Jesus.
Yeah, and I can't believe that. I mean, have people even seen these manuals? Especially the very online folks who are sort of very.
No,
of course they don't, right? And of course they don't. And again, just real quick on Pieper. I love the fact that Pieper, regularly quotes Nietzsche, Heidegger. I mean, he's deeply read in what is going on, and yet. There he is. He's a faithful, inspiring, philosopher in the 20th century. It's just
all did this. I mean, Guardini, Bouillet, de Lubac, Chenu.
Don't say Balthazar. Don't say Balthazar.
Ratzinger. Yeah, I saw the other day some Tridentine traditionalists on Facebook saying, "Well, Balthazar is the problem," and I point out in my thing, you know what? I don't want to be too judgmental here, but in my experience. Very few of these traditionalists have actually read extensively in the authors that they criticize. Instead, they'll read a book by, say, Ralph Martin on von Balthasar, on hell, And oh, okay, so Balthasar taught everybody goes to heaven. He didn't, by the way.
Right.
But this becomes then a talking point.
Sure.
And so, oh, this is why we can't trust Balthasar. Well, I did my doctoral dissertation on Balthasar. He wrote more than God.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
his whole theological trilogy, the aesthetic, the dramatic, the logic, and so forth, is this unbelievably profound and rich rethinking in very, very, or this is the
That's the thing, right? This
very
is the point.
orthodox categories.
Right.
He was actually, when he was writing, considered an arch conservative. When I did my dissertation at Fordham in the early '90s, I had opposition from the Jesuits there,
Right, of course.
because they thought Balthasar was a reactionary nut job. You know, he was arch conservative. Joe Fessio at Ignatius Press is pushing this. He supported Humanae Vitae. He was against women ordinance, the whole 9 yards. But because he wrote that book, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved, he is consigned to the flames of hell by these people. And this is part of a problem with the Tridentine traditionalist movement. They are ideologically driven by an ecclesiological agenda. I call it an ecclesiological idolatry.
Yeah.
Where they have a certain form of the church that they want to maintain, and then they weaponize it. And this is my main problem with it.
Okay.
They weaponize this vision and turn it against people that are actually their natural allies. The Ressourcement thinkers were not liberals. They were thought of as progressives in their day simply because they were going beyond Neoscholasticism.
Right.
But they were not secular progressive liberals like the kinds I'm talking about in my book. Not.
So
The
Larry,
Democrats need to get out of their own way.
well, okay, so this Neoscholasticism thing, I think it's a point worth sort of hitting on a little bit more. You're a theologian. You taught for many years. What is Neoscholasticism, and why was that a kind of dead end for the river, to use your analogy, for the river of the church?
It was an attempt to, in light of Leo the 13th's very legitimate, like you said, to hold up Aquinas as a model for doing theology. And by the way, so did John Paul and
Right.
and
He
McKelvey.
did his dissertation. He did his master's thesis, I believe, on Thomas.
Yeah, he did. Or actually, he did his dissertation.
Dissertation. Sorry.
John
Yeah. Sorry.
Paul, I think. I don't know. Anyway, it was a legitimate response to Leo the 13th's call to take Thomas Aquinas seriously again as a model of theology. But what they did then was they once again they tried to stick it within that Tridentine model of defensive argumentation. It was very ahistorical. They approached both Aquinas and church doctrine in general in a completely ahistorical way, not rooting anything in any kind of historical context or development. In fact, their point was nothing can develop. Basically, the church reached its apex in the 13th century intellectually, and we need to freeze it there. And so the scholastic manuals were very superficial. They did not want to deal with modern philosophy at all, or modern currents of thought, and they just issued this sort of very truncated and stiffened sort of model of Thomism in these manuals that could then be taught to priests in seminaries. And they contain a lot of truth, actually. I don't want to be too hard on them. I mean, they do contain a lot of basic Catholic truths.
Right, but it's not a dynamic tradition. It becomes a calcified tradition, right?
Yeah, a lot of the Ressourcement guys described Neoscholasticism, as sort of like a desert, an intellectual desert, where you're just chomping at the bit to dive into questions and issues more deeply. But then you would run into this brick wall that would say you cannot go there. You can't.
So truth then, right? So truth then does not become the orientation point. It becomes sort of and actually in a weird sort of way, it's like sort of politics trumps truth, right? The politics of keeping the church sort of protected. So my traditional minded friends will say something like, well, thanks and all, but just because you wanted to go off and sort of explore these issues of theology, you wrecked my church.
Yeah, that's the claim. But I would make the claim that, as I do in the blog, that their diagnostics are flawed.
Okay.
That it's a sort of post hoc ergo propter hoc form of thinking, that because the great craziness in the church came after Ressourcement theology, after the sort of eclipsing, I don't want to say the death because it's still around, the eclipsing of Neoscholasticism. And by the way, a lot of good Thomists were against Neoscholasticism too. A lot of good Thomists, Gilson and people like that, Pieper, Maritain, They were all sort of against it. But anyway, and there were various schools of Thomas, by the way, various schools of Thomism. And that's the other problem with Neoscholasticism. It presumed that there was only one
Yeah.
way to do Thomas. You had the transcendental Thomists like Mary Shaw, the existential Thomists like Gilson. You've got the classical sort of thinking Thomists like Pieper. You've got personalist Thomists like Maritain and Norris Clark and others. It's just wrong to sort of limit Aquinas to this narrow thing. But so
Okay.
you're right. The tradies, though, say in getting rid of that, you ruined my church. No, not really.
Right. So it's a bad interpretation. It's a bad reading
It is a bad reading.
things.
It's utterly simplistic.
But why? Okay. But I don't disagree with you, Larry. But why is that so attractive? Because right now, if you do a scan of the Twitter or the Facebook or wherever, why is it so attractive? Do you think?
Pope Francis.
Okay.
I think. I mean,
What do you mean?
As you said earlier, as segueing into this whole thing, there seems to have been a surge. There's always been traditionalists around. There's always been people who want to go back to I love the old Latin Mass too. Want to go back to the old Latin Mass, and okay, fine. I'm a traditionalist too. I really am a traditionalist,
Yeah.
and I like all that stuff too. So did Ratzinger. But I noticed something here. Traditionalists of that sort were perfectly okay and fine and happy, with some exceptions, with the pontificate of John Paul and the pontificate of Benedict. They were critical of some things, like John Paul with that Assisi.
I was just going to say, like John Paul, right?
By the way,
at the time they were basic fans of JP2. Now, to hear it on the internet that the only thing that John Paul II did is in his entire pontificate was, razz the Polish commies and show up at Assisi and sell out the faith.
Yeah. And once again, it's utterly simplistic, and doesn't deal with the. I mean, he wrote so many encyclicals. To me, the great benefit of John Paul is that he gave us the proper hermeneutic and the proper interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. We'll come back in a second why there's a surge, which is Pope Francis, I think. But one of the things the traditionalists are always saying with regard to blaming Vatican II for all of this is that all the silliness came after Vatican II, therefore Vatican II caused it. I don't think that's true. I think in reality, Vatican II was hijacked by a group of liberal theologians, primarily because they had culture on their side.
What do you mean by that? They had culture on their side. I don't disagree, but what do you mean?
When the American bishops came back from the council, they were greeted by an American Catholic public that had been propagandized by the secular and Catholic media to believe that big liberal changes were coming, and that the council was a liberalizing council, and that we were going to get rid of clerical celibacy, and we were going to have married, women priests, and contraception was going to be allowed, was a big thing in the 60s and so on. And then there were a group of very liberal theologians in the United States and Western Europe that were very ready to pounce and to make use of that media spin of the council. And most lay people, and this is an indictment on the pre-conciliar church, actually, most lay people were not well formed enough in the faith to resist that tide. And most lay people were more than happy to embrace a more liberal view of, I don't have to do this, I don't have to do that, this is great. All right, and so they were fed this bill of goods, and then bishops were, in a sense, overwhelmed by this tsunami of dissent and experimentation that they just literally did not know what to do about, except to revert back to an old model of excommunications and forbidden books, which they didn't want to do. So they were.
And they don't have the stomach for that.
They didn't have the stomach for it. Bishops are don't rock the boat company guys.
Yep.
They didn't want to do that, and so you end up with all this. Now, so therefore, my point would be this: the traditionalists might agree with that assessment, and they would then say, "But hey, these liberals are all claiming the council as their inspiration. The media is claiming the council as their inspiration." And my rejoinder is, why should we allow those people to be the definers of what the council meant? Councils often kick up dust in their wake. Ask Athanasius what he had to pay at post-Nicaea. Arians didn't go away overnight after Nicaea.
That's right.
Many emperors were still Arians. Athanasius suffered greatly in defense of Nicene orthodoxy. So the idea that
The victory in hindsight seems much more triumphant than it was in reality.
exactly. So we have to get away from this idea that if a council creates confusion, therefore it's the council's fault. Most great councils cause a little bit of confusion, if not a great amount of confusion. So post-Vatican II, I'm saying the Hans Kungs of the church don't get to define what the council is. The council is an act of the magisterium. Therefore, what does that council mean? It means what the magisterium says it means. And that's why John Paul's papacy is so important, and Benedict's, because those two popes tell us what the council meant. It corrected certain ambiguities, they corrected certain misinterpretations, and therefore, in my mind, it's wrong to simply say Vatican II. You need to say Vatican II and its appropriation by the post-Vatican II conciliar popes. That's what John Paul meant by taking the names John and Paul, by the way, is we need to have this
John the 23rd, Paul
of
the 6th.
interpretation and implementation. Therefore, I would say, well, the Rad Trads or the Tridentine traditions are right to see that problems came up after the council. They are wrong, however, I think, to blame the council for it. I will go so far, but we'll get to that later about the naivetes and all that. But I think what has really caused the surge lately is Pope Francis.
Okay, so Pope Francis, right, because if your argument is going to hold here and be operative, that the magisterium gets to decide what the proper interpretation of the council is, and certainly John Paul II spent a vast majority of his intellectual powers enumerating or laying that out and clarifying that, as with Benedict XVI, both as Cardinal Ratzinger at the CDF and then as Pope Benedict XVI. But here we are, and we're in a different place, aren't we?
We are, because, and I have to admit, I share the deep concerns of people like Steve Skojec, for example, with regard to Pope Francis, because he does create enormous problems for me as well, in my view, that the magisterium gets to determine what the magisterial council meant. Now, Pope Francis hasn't repudiated John Paul and Benedict, and so as far as I'm concerned, the hermeneutic of the council that those two popes provided still stands. I mean, yeah, Pope Francis has done some things and said some things that seems to spin the council back in that ridiculous 1960s 5 direction. But he has not issued any major encyclicals or anything that would directly repudiate, the pontificates of JP2 and Benedict. But it is Francis who has radicalized these people. I think mainly because of so many of his off-the-cuff statements about homosexuality or church. I think he's a deeply incoherent pope. He elevates into the episcopacy or into Vatican office cardinals like Supich, Tobin, Farrell. He promotes James Martin, gives James Martin a photo op. And so, of course, lots of people were thinking, well, he's gay friendly. He's all into
I would call it modernist accommodationist friendly.
Yeah, well, there you go. Let's appease.
Let's call it right.
Okay, and so that's why when the CDF document came out, it's thud. All right, and so you say, well, what does this guy think? So let's for example, if you were to look at the great wish list of liberal progressive Catholics, what they want, Pope Francis has given them hardly any of them. They want women priests. He hasn't given them women priests. They want married priests. He hasn't given them married priests. They want a change to the teaching on contraception. He has not given them a change to the teaching on contraception. They wanted a change on teaching on homosexuality and sexuality in general. He hasn't done that either. I mean, and you could go down a list of liberal wish lists, and he has simply said, "Niet, we're not going to do that." So in the one sense, he's this very, as he said himself, I am a loyal son of the church, all right? But then on the flip side, where the rubber meets the road, personnel is policy, he appoints all these really awful people. Right?
Yeah, and I think that is going to leave us in this sort of uncomfortable space for really quite some time.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if he's not being very Jesuitical here.
Yeah.
And if he isn't playing a long game, if he isn't actually in his heart and soul fairly liberal, but he doesn't want to create a schism, so he doesn't just come out and make all these changes all at once by papal fiat, because he knows that would kick up a huge, horrible storm in the church. So what he can't accomplish by ripping the Band-Aid off the scab, he's just going to accomplish through a slow drift by appointing people who think like this.
Yeah.
And I think that is the suspicion of a lot of us in this regard.
Yeah. Okay.
But then you've got the incoherence of him talking about synodality. So the Germans take him for, okay, we're going to have
take him at his word.
We're going to have all these changes. And then he comes out and says, no, you can't do that. So
and they're sort of like, well, why?
Yeah.
I could see. I'm no fan of the German synod, as I'm sure everybody in the audience will be shocked to hear. But but part of me sort of like, well, why wouldn't they think they could just sort of move forward with all this sort of thing? So I want to tack quickly before I want to draw this show to a close, because I would like to tack over and set up our next show. But I want to talk here about what you call the council's double naivete. And I understand you to mean the if the council had sort of made this proclamation to read the signs of the times, you seem to suggest that they misread doubly. And you lay it out this way. You say that that it was a misread of the internal health of church culture leading into the council, and a misread of the external secular culture, the kind of the hostile ambient culture in which the council was operating in and into. So what do you want to do with that?
In one sense, I'd like to correct what I wrote there.
Oh, okay, go.
When I say the council was guilty of a double naivete, I should have been clearer to say I think the council fathers were guilty.
Okay, fair. And you may have said that in the piece. I might. But that's
no,
good...
I don't think I did, and I should have made a sharper distinction, because I think the documents they produced aren't necessarily naive, but they certainly were as they went to implement those documents. That's the key.
Yeah, I want to come back to the implement question later.
Yeah, but the thing is, I think most council fathers really had this naive belief that the preconciliar church still had this deep reservoir of Catholic faith and Catholic vitality and Catholic life, because they were looking at certain external metrics and external barometers without looking at the internal sort of life of the church, and there were plenty of people before the council who were pointing this out. I mean, Ratzinger himself in 1958 wrote that article, the new paganism in the church. But also, many of these, even Gary Gould-Lagrange was porting these things up. Literary figures like Bernanos, his great book, The Diary of a Country Priest, was premised on the idea that nobody had faith anymore. And he's writing this when, I don't know, in the 40s?
40s, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And so, I mean, lots and lots and lots of leading Catholic intellectuals were already pointing out that the life of the church was not good before.
And I should just interject here, Larry. I think this is precisely where our friends in the sort of the traditional camp really misread history. They have a very romantic, sentimental read of the pre-conciliar church, like in the actual day-to-day life of it.
Some of the more savvy ones, like Peter Kwasniewski, for example, would say, yeah, you're right. The preconciliar life of the church was not all that great. I mean, Peter's all about the liturgy and all that more than...
Well, I want to go there because, but go ahead.
Yeah. But he would acknowledge the internal life of the church was not all that great, which is exactly why the council should not have lifted the lid off of the ecclesiastical libido, because it wasn't... Right. It wasn't ready for that.
Yeah.
And so that's why but the thing is, I'm not so certain Vatican II actually, as a council, did that. I mean,
amen. Okay, this is exactly my point. Okay, this is the thing that drives me bonkers in all of these conversations is we talk about the council, we talk about Vatican II, and you're a trained theologian, and all of these untrained Facebook commentators like me, we talk about Vatican II all the time. But my contention is we're not really talking about Vatican II. I think what we're really talking about is 1968.
That's exactly right.
It's like Vatican II, for all the bluster and the Facebook posts and the YouTube videos about, Vatican II this and Vatican II that, and we need to get rid of the council. They're not even really talking about that. They're talking about the fact that, at this sort of operative moment where everything's going to change and people are getting their news about the council through the New Yorker and right, and all this sort of stuff. And really the thing that people think of when they think of Vatican II is not Lumen Gentium, it's not, the documents, it's the Mass.
Oh, yeah. I often say, if the council had not if the post-conciliar church had not developed the Novus Ordo and had simply stuck with the traditional Latin Mass, I think there would have been problems in a different. In other words, I'm not a fan of the Novus Ordo, but I think that reform was needed. But anyway, if we'd never gone away from the TLM, I don't think we'd be having this conversation.
I totally agree. That's where maybe that's just quick shorthand. I agree.
Conversation, the liturgy, and that had nothing to do. Well, it had something to do with the council in the sense the council called for reform. But go and read Sacra Sanctorum.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't call for all the craziness that happened. Gregorian chant is to give in pride a place and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that was a derailment of the council for all the reasons I said earlier about the culture and and
a strange elision, like it's a strange sort of like bait and switch, right? Which I think plays into the sort of part two of your double naivete, Larry, which is a misreading by the church, let's say, partially that's the well-meaning men of goodwill who were enthusiastic about the reforms of Vatican II and that project, the council project. They were walking into a culture that, the ambient culture, right, the surrounding, church culture, the secular culture that was deeply antagonistic, deeply hostile even.
And we need to remember a couple of things here. First, those same bishops that sort of went along with the liberal craze after the council were formed before the council. They weren't formed by the council. Mm-hmm. They were formed before the council. Yeah. And so it is kind of an indictment of the intellectual shallowness and spiritual shallowness that the preconciliar church instilled in these men who became bishops, that they would be so easily swayed by this cultural appeasement argument of the liberals that we need to move into this more irenic dialogue with modern culture and so on, not seeing how insane such an approach to things was. People also need to remember that, at the council itself, it was really only a handful of influential cardinals and bishops and their theological advisors that wrote the documents, developed the documents, and so forth. The rest of the conciliar bishops were largely spectators, and when it came time to vote, it was, yes, let's go over to Piazza Navona now, and wine, and blah, 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 and talk about the state of the... I don't want to be too insouciant here. I mean, they were one of the great benefits that they were all gaining from the council was meeting bishops from all over the world and talking about the worldwide church and its problems. Mm-hmm. And so, as anybody who's ever gone to a theology conference knows, or any kind of academic conference, the real conference is the conference outside of the papers that are being given. Yeah. In the cocktail hour and so forth, and dinners out. That's why you go to those things, and that's why most bishops were at the council, in terms of their own mind. So they weren't really formed by the council. They were formed before, and when they got home, they were easily swayed by all of these liberal directions, and they just didn't understand. They were naive with regard to how toxic the culture was.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, Larry, I'm going to draw this show to a close because I think we hit on really kind of what I wanted to cover. We sort of set up this taxonomy. We talked about these sort of two naive misreadings of the situation, both what came before and what the church really was, like in the main, and what it was about to walk into. And I want to set up our next show, which is something you say at the very end of part 3, I believe, which is this great line. The problem with Vatican II was not that it was too radical, but that it was not nearly radical enough. And you go on to talk about the dynamite of holiness. And so let's leave it there. Next show, we're going to talk about this dynamite of holiness, and really how holiness, the universal call to holiness, as you, I think, correctly point out, is the thing that the council was about. And it is largely the thing that all three of our camps, in their respective ways, studiously avoid.
Yeah.
All right, so send us off, Larry. Any closing shots before we set up for our next show?
No, I thought this was a great conversation.
Good.
Just thank you for, and a happy Holy Saturday. And
Yes, we're doing this on Holy Saturday, and if we can get our acts together, we'll have our next show out soon as well. So until then, thank you for listening, everybody. I am Kale Zelden, and with me today was Dr. Larry Chapp. And I will provide in the show notes links for all four of Larry's pieces on the numbing down of the church. Until then, take care, Godspeed, and God bless. Bye now.